So we're going to run through today my workshop on how to apply for grants, but we're going to use the One Community Grassroots Grant Fund application form as an example. So we're going to look at the specific questions that are in there. But note that, as you'll know, if you've done a bit of fundraising in the past, the questions are very similar across different applications. You come across the same questions again and again. You might have a different word count, they might be worded slightly differently. But as you get better at kind of putting these answers together for application forms, it gets easier and you can, begin to copy and paste a bit of what you've written previously. So it will apply to other grants that you might want to apply for. We're just going to use this as an example. And because it's something that's open currently, and we're really trying to encourage as many people to apply for as possible. I've then got some other resources in terms of how to look for funding opportunities, both local and national ones, different places that I would recommend you look for resources, the support that you can get both from myself and from TSL. And then we'll have a few opportunities for questions as we go through the slides, particularly at the end of each question. I'll just give you a few moments to have a think about the answers that you might put in your application. So you might either want to have a pen and paper handy or an open document on your computer. And then, although it's a bit tricky for me to look at the chat and see anyone that's got their hand up as we go through, I'll pause every now and again and I'll take questions and take questions at the end as well. I'm more than happy to have a chat through any kind of questions or anywhere that anybody's stuck on this particular application form as well. So the Grassroots Grant Fund that's open at the moment, it's really targeted at those small community projects. They describe it around local empowerment, pride in place, and the kind of projects that enhance life chances, all within Kirklees. So this is funding that has been provided by the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. You might have heard of this. It's part of the UK government's levelling up agenda, of which Kirklees has received a fairly significant amount of funding for the local authority area, some of which, like this, is to trickle all the way down to those grassroots community groups. So we've had the first round of the Grassroots Fund already. We've supported a number of groups through that, but round 2 is due to open on the 1st of May and will close at the end of that same month. So these are for projects that will start after the 26th of July. So this is the round that we're focusing on now and encouraging people to prepare for. There are a few things that have been updated since the first round. Although all projects need to be delivered in Kirklees, the grant amount was originally up to £1,000 and it's now up to £2,000, which can be spent over a period of 12 months. So in the slides that I'll share, it'll link directly to the application form there. The other thing that One Community have done since the first round is they've provided an example of a completed application that you can refer to sort of compare yours to and get a better idea of what information they're looking for. So the criteria for this particular funding, it's all about empowerment and community-driven projects. So they very much want projects that are driven and designed by the local community. They want things that really are needed by the community and that organisations can evidence that it's needed by people that they're already working with. They also really want organisations based in the areas that they're delivering in, which is why it's grassroots. They will accept applications from Kirklees-wide groups and West Yorkshire-based organisations, but they are prioritising those local groups that really know their communities the best. They've given a few examples which I think work quite well to highlight what it is they're looking for. An example of establishing community gardens to promote healthy eating, provide a sense of community ownership. This idea that a group of residents can work together to maintain something, to improve something. We had a couple of people in the last workshop that were doing something similar about taking over a local outdoor space and making it a usable space for the community. So things like that. There's a focus on health and well-being as well. So they've given an example of fitness classes, wellness workshops, health screenings, anything that improves the overall health of residents. And also programs that focus on young people in the community. So that might be after school activities, mentorship, sports clubs, anything that focuses on people, community leaders within that area, working and inspiring young people. Also things like coffee mornings that tackle isolation, bring people together, particularly older people or those more vulnerable members of a community. They really like to see that kind of thing as well. So most groups that we've been in contact with will be eligible to apply, because it's quite broad in that you don't have to be a registered charity to apply, but you do need to have a constitution. So even if you've just set up as a community group, you need to have at least a constitution and 3 members who've signed that to agree what the aims and objectives of your group are. And I'll come on to that a little bit more in a minute. You don't need to have GAP registration. I've put this in because it's just something I get asked about quite a lot. Funding through Kirklees Council requires you to have GAP registration. This is not connected to that. It's through one community, so it doesn't matter if you don't have that. Although for some other funding that you might be looking at, again, this GAP registration is something that we can help with if necessary. And as mentioned, you'll need to have at least 3 people, whether those are members, trustees, directors, 3 people who are unrelated to one another, involved in the running of your group or charity. And then you'll need a bank account. So as I mentioned earlier, this is something that particularly a lot of new groups are struggling with, because there seems to be quite a delay in getting bank accounts open. So you either need your own bank account in the name of your organisation. And again, I was working with a group last week whose bank account was in an individual's name, and they were not eligible to apply for any funding at that stage. But if you need support with in this process of waiting for a bank account, the community anchors can help with that in holding funds on your behalf. Now, this is something that they've revised slightly since the first round, but they're still prioritising small community organisations and groups with a turnover of less than 25,000 a year. It was 10,000 in the first round. I think they've revised this partially because they're really wanting to encourage more and more groups to apply and to widen the criteria, really. I will just say on that, I don't know if you know anything different, Ibra, but they're not excluding larger organisations or larger charities in the area. If you're a larger charity and you're doing something that's really local to a particular community, then that doesn't exclude you from applying. It's just that if they have so much funding to give out, they'll prioritise those smaller organisations to the larger ones that may be more financially stable. So the online application form is fairly straightforward. Again, I'll send a link both to the application form itself and to a completed application that you can refer to. But it basically starts off asking for things like your organisation's name and address, contact, the date you were started up, and the type of organisation you are, as well as how many staff and volunteers you have. You'll need to give your project a name, a start and an end date, and you'll need a Kirklees postcode of where it's going to be delivered. They'll also ask which ward most of your beneficiaries come from, and if you get stuck with this or you're unsure, there's a search function on Kirklees Council website that you can use to identify the ward that you're based in. So the first main question that we come up against in this application is to describe the overall aims and objectives of your organisation and the activities or services your organisation provides. So I'll run through a few tips and things to think about when writing about your aims and objectives, and you might want to make a few notes as we go I'll give you a couple of examples as well. So if we think about an aim as a clearly directed intent or purpose, so my aim is to win this race, then your objective is something towards which effort is directed. So how will you do that? So you'll train for 2 hours every day so that you can win that race. So the way I like to think of it is when we set up you set up a community group, you set up a business or a charity, there's some reason behind that. For most people, it's, the desire to make a difference, to do something good in their community, to fix a problem or something like that. So what is that aim, that defining purpose or goal of your organization? What's the reason behind it being set up as a charity or as a not-for-profit organization? And then the objectives that you will agree on are all the things that you're going to do, the actions that you're going to plan to actually reach that goal. So if the aim is the what, then the objective is the how. So in the application form, we need to tell the funder what type of organisation you are, what you were set up to do, what your vision or mission is, and then what your key objectives are. So just take a couple of minutes to have a think about what you might write there and how you might want to describe that. One of my favourite examples is this food bank in Derbyshire there. The way that they state their aim is that no one in Derby or Derbyshire is affected by homelessness and the associated poverty and social isolation. So that's the reason behind their existence. And then their objectives, which are what are they going to do to achieve that aim, is that they'll support and empower people affected by homelessness to improve their lives. They'll do this by providing food, toiletries, clothes and facilities, support, advice, training and volunteering, and they'll support them to move into and sustain a tenancy. So you can see that if they consistently did all of those 3 activities, then they would reach or at least contribute to that aim of affecting homelessness. So it's just being able to sum it up in 100 words for this application. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes now, just have a think about how you might write about your aims and objectives. Okay, so the next question on the form is, what is the aim of your project? Tell us what you're trying to achieve with your project. So I like to start here by thinking, imagine if the person reading your application, everyone on the panel, has never come across your group before. They don't know what you're doing. And I think it's quite easy to make some assumptions that people have either heard of an area, they've heard of a particular need, they might have even heard of your organisation, what you do. But remember that the people on the panel, they may not even be, most of them in this case will be local to Kirklees, but they certainly will not know everything that's going on across the area. And by writing in a way that, you're starting from the beginning, explain it really, really clearly so there's absolutely no doubt about what it is that you're setting out to do. So here are a few things to think about when talking about your project. First of all, who? So who is your project for? Again, when I run through these, I'm conscious that we've now only got 100 words to try and get this information across. But even just thinking about these and putting a sentence for each will really help to clarify it for the funder, exactly what it is that you're asking for funding for. So who is your project for? Can you describe who your target beneficiaries are? Who is it that you're wanting to help? Are they people of a specific gender or age or background or other demographics that you can use? Are they people who share a particular issue, challenge or concern? And in most cases for this particular funding anyway, it's likely that they'll all live in the same town, village or neighbourhood. They might even all live on the same street. So it's really getting down to the detail of who are the people that you're delivering this project for. And who do you want to help? So in addition to that, it can be helpful to think about who are the people who most need the support or service you're offering. For example, you might run a coffee morning and it might be open to anybody within that village, but who are the people that you think most would need that most and would get the most out of it, that are the ones that you're really targeting? And then think about how they would describe themselves. This can be difficult because the way that we think about someone else's need might not be how they think about it themselves. You know, we might consider that somebody must be lonely or they must need help with particular tasks and things. They might just think, you know, I'm I'm still independent. I'm perfectly capable of doing all these things, but I know I would benefit from being in a group of like-minded people once a week. So think about how they would describe themselves rather than how you might describe them, and how they would share what they need support with. And you can also add in here, although it'll ask you in a different part of the application, it's also helpful to add in how many people you're planning to support through your project. And then what are you hoping to achieve with your project? So if we imagine we've come to the end of your project, you've spent the funding, it was a huge success. What would that look like, and what would it mean to your community? So I'll come on to talking a bit more in detail about outputs and outcomes, but thinking about your end goal and describing that to the funder. So what would be the ideal result of the delivery of your project? What would that look like? And here, giving the funder a clear picture of what a successful project would look like might include things like, how do people feel? What are they saying to you? Your project has been a great success. What difference has it made to real people? Has it been worth, applying for the funding for, delivering it, doing an evaluation? What have you found out? What have you achieved in actually running it? Now, here we get into the detail of when and how often will your project happen. So being really, really clear about when your project will happen, whether that's a number of sessions, activities, because we need to be really clear to the funder what they're paying for, how many workshops or how many sessions or how many open days or how many training workshops, how many people will be attending. So thinking about the details of exactly what you're delivering in terms of how often it will happen. And then your timescales as well. So you've got up to 12 months to deliver this particular project. The majority of funding is for 12 months. Sometimes it can be longer than that. But you've got some clear start and finish dates here already. So within that, can you share some key events or milestones? For example, at a certain date, you'll start promoting your project online. Your first session will be running this particular week or month. And when do you intend to finish? And what time at the end will you allow for asking people for feedback and writing that up? And then where will it take place? So particularly in funding like this, that's very, very local, we need to be very specific about where it will be delivered. So do you have a venue or location like a community centre, or is it, out and about at different places in your area? You might also want to say why you've chosen to deliver there. So it might be because it's accessible on foot or on public transport, or is it somewhere that the people that you're wanting to help already go? It's somewhere that they're already familiar with and they feel safe and welcome. Also thinking about where are you needed. So it can feel like it makes sense to run something in the town centre, for example, somewhere local that more people might be able to access. But actually, is that putting off people who don't want to travel into a town centre? They don't want to use public transport. They want something in their local community. And funding like this is a really good opportunity to do something in a wide variety of places, and you going to them rather than asking people to come to you. So in that, is your project designed to remove those barriers to people being able to participate by actually being genuinely local within that particular area? And then why is it needed? So what's the reason behind this project idea that you've come up with? Have you noticed or been told that something is missing in your community? Most projects come from this need. Something is not happening, something is not working that you want to fix. So what is that, and how can you describe that? And then why is your organisation the one to make a difference? So if there's a problem, an issue, something that needs to be tackled in your local community, why are you the one to actually carry that out? And it can be helpful to think about, why is another organisation not doing this? It might be that they are, it might be that there are other organisations doing similar things, but of course no one can do everything that's needed or support everything. So it might be that there's more demand than that there's current provision for. It might be that what you plan to do is slightly different or complementary to that, or it's for a slightly different demographic or group of people. So really thinking about why you are the one to deliver it, and what kind of qualifies you to reach those people or address that need that's been identified in your community. How will your project be delivered? So here we're getting to the detail of exactly what will you do. So say that you've received the funding, you've been successful. What's the first thing that you would do? How would you tell people about it? What would you need to do to plan to turn that idea into action? How exactly will you get started? Who would you need to talk to? Would you need to book a room? Would you need to recruit anybody or train up some volunteers? All these details of how you will actually get it from a project that's on paper to something that's being delivered in the community. And how will it work? So remember that the funder will want some details, not loads of detail, but some information on what will happen. Say that you're running particular sessions or activities. What will happen in each one? How many staff or volunteers will be there, and what will they need to do? What will they actually be delivering? And also, really importantly, how will people hear about the sessions? How will you promote them and tell people what's going on so that they can decide whether it's of interest to them? So there's a lot of things to think about there. I'll just give you a few minutes again now. And as I say, it's not easy to squeeze this into 100 words, but if you can try within those couple of paragraphs to think about the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your project, you'll then get the information across to the funds that they need to be able to make that assessment. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes now if you want to jot down any thoughts on that. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. There are 2 or 3 questions in the application form about outputs, outcomes, and impact. And again, this is something that, although I go into a lot more detail in my longer workshops, I know it's something that people get stuck on. So I'll just run through some definitions that you might find helpful. The outputs of your project are always numbers. So these are the tangible results of your project that you can measure. So it might be, for example, the number of activities or sessions that you're running. It might even be an improvement in something, such as attendance at school, or it might be the end result of your project, like the number of participants securing a job. Whereas outcomes, slightly harder to measure because these are the difference that your project has made. This might be, do people feel more confident? Do they feel happier or less anxious? So these are the kind of answers that you might get if you hand out participant feedback forms at the end. This is people telling you how they feel as a result of taking part in your project. And there are ways we can measure that. We can measure things around well-being and mental health, for example. It's not always necessary to do that in great detail for small grants such as this, but having something in place where you're asking people what difference it's made to them from the beginning, so from before they participated to afterwards, can be a really helpful way to gauge the success of your project. And then impact is more about the long-term effects of your project, whether that's on your beneficiaries, on the community, or on your organisation. So this is, in the longer term, how will your project affect real change? I like to use an example from the Prince's Trust where I worked for a number of years, because this is where I really learned how to talk about outputs, outcomes, and impact. This is an example of how we used to talk about it with employability programs for young people. So the output was 10 young people secure an apprenticeship. The outcome was that 70% of participants told us that they felt more confident about getting a job as a result of being on this program. And then the impact is that if we continue to run this employability program every month for the next 5 or 10 years, then in the long run, this program will contribute towards reducing unemployment between 18 to 25-year-olds in West Yorkshire. Another example from what might be more relatable to some of you. Say you are a local wellbeing group running some sessions for older people. The output might be that 20 older people who live alone attend a group activity in a warm space twice a week. It's really specific how we're talking about how many people, how often, and what they get out of it. It's really measurable. The outcome of that might be that 90% of those attendees will tell us that they've made new friends, that they feel less isolated and feel part of their community again. And then the long-term impact of that. And I always say here, even if you're the smallest group helping at, 5 or 6 attendees each week, that group might be replicated by other similar organisations across Kirklees, across West Yorkshire, across the country. And collectively, as a group of organisations focusing on positive mental health and wellbeing, in turn, we reduce the pressure on the NHS and other support services. So thinking about it in that way, from the very immediate results of a project to the longer term impact that it could have, can again help you to think about the meaning and the motivation behind what it is that you do. So if you keep those definitions and examples in mind, there are 3 questions actually on this application. The first 2 are what outputs will be delivered to achieve this aim. So the project that you've just described is now asking you what outputs will be delivered to achieve the aim, and then what outcomes will be delivered. You've got 200 words to answer each of those. It then asks you a follow-up question, which is, please explain how you will track the outcomes and outputs of your project. So we don't need to do too much around evaluation and impact measurement on such small projects, but you'll see here they do still ask about it. It's basically how are you going to prove that you've achieved what you've said you'll set out and achieve. So tracking and measuring can usually be kept very simple for these types of projects. You might want to think about tracking things such as how many people inquire about your project, how many people actually turn up and participate, and then, if possible, noting any demographics of those people that you support, such as age, gender, ethnicity, postcode, anything else that's really relevant to your project. These, it's not always the same things that you need to track. You'll know what they are. It might just be whether people are from your local area or outside your local area. It might be something as simple as that, what their kind of invested interest is in the project. But tracking something and thinking about it before your project starts rather than at the end is much easier, because it's much harder to kind of look back and try and remember everything that people have said or who's turned up and everything like that. Just having a really simple kind of checklist or a form that you can hand out to people to gather this information as you go through will make it much easier to report on that at the end. So a feedback form, again, really simple way to ask people, like, if they've enjoyed the session or what they've got out of it. You might want to just ask them to tick it. You might want to give them multiple choice. Do they feel less isolated? Do they feel more informed? Do they feel happier and more fulfilled? Do they feel more confident? Whatever it is that's relevant to your project, just giving out a simple feedback form. And it can be anonymous. You don't need to collect names or dates of birth or anything like that. Can be really helpful and to report back to the funder on. So this application goes on to ask you to pick a few things. They have a number of drop-down lists, including the impact and outcomes, how many people will benefit from this funding. It'll ask you to select beneficiary types, and then it'll do the same for ethnicity, issues, and age groups. It's the same one community form that they use for all of their grants. So if you've seen it before, you'll be used to that. I'll just always say, don't worry too much about that. Just try and pick the one that's the most relevant to you. Most groups find that their beneficiary are a bit broader than that they actually want to tick more than one box. It's more for one community's own kind of internal assessment of which types of groups they're supporting and everything, making sure that the funding is being spread to a wide range of groups. It's not necessarily something that's going to affect your score too much. Okay, so we'll come on to project budget. So they will ask you, of course, how much you are applying for, and then they'll ask for a breakdown of these costs. They'll ask for your bank details. We've discussed that already, and they'll ask for the names of your bank signatories as well. Now, project costs, again, can be kept quite simple here, and they don't need a great amount of detail, but they do want you to think about what exactly you would spend the money on. So you might want to think about using these headings. If your project was successful, what are the costs? Are there any staff costs, volunteer costs, that kind of thing? Would you need to hire or book a room? What are the delivery costs for actually carrying out your project? That might be anything from materials to refreshments. Are there any travel costs for staff or volunteers or even participants? And then, is there a cost to your marketing? Are you just going to do that through word of mouth and your own social media? Or will you need to do any advertising or pay for any flyers or posters, that kind of thing? And then your overheads as well. You can include a percentage of any of the overhead costs, such as utility bills, things like that. I'll come on to that in a second. So this is an example of what would be acceptable to one community for this level of project. Of course, if it was a much bigger project, it might need to be quite a bit more detailed, but you'll always need to give them the heading for each cost and then a calculation. So as much as possible, tell them how you've worked out these costs. So for example, you might need to pay 2 facilitators each for 3 hours at £15 per hour for 5 sessions. So rather than just putting in the £450, make sure that you tell them how you've worked that out and exactly what it'll go towards. The same with volunteer or travel costs and venue hire, making it really clear what each line there is paying for. I usually say if you have, again, if you're a very, very small organization, you might not have overheads yet, or you might not have very much, but even startup organizations usually have something like website costs or insurance, accountancy fees, things like that. These things add up very, very quickly. So one way to think about this is if you add up all of the costs of actually keeping your organization open, you can always include at least 10% in any funding application to contribute towards that. So as long as you've got that figure of this is how much it costs us for our utilities, insurance, IT over the course of a year, and then apply for a small percentage of that, in most cases that's considered to be reasonable to include. And then it'll ask you for some supporting documents. I know, again, this was mentioned at the beginning, particularly if you haven't applied to one community before, they want to see a little bit more background information. So they'll ask for your constitution or governing document, whatever is relevant to your group. They'll ask to see a bank statement to confirm that it's in the name of your organisation. And if you are a registered charity, you'll have to submit your latest accounts as well. And then other organisations that are not charities, as Ibra mentioned, need to supply either a cash flow or management accounts or something that is showing their current financial position. So again, if this is, I won't go into too much detail in this now, but if this is something that you get stuck on, then please do come to us and we can help with that. So as mentioned, this current funding, the Grassroots Fund, is through One Community, but One Community have our community foundation here in Kirklees. They have a number of different grants programs available. Their regular community grants program is up to 3,000, and they have a number of deadlines for this each year. So this is one of the pots of funding that I always encourage new and local groups to go for as kind of one of the first bits of funding that you apply for, because it's local. You know what they're looking for. The application form is very straightforward, and they are very supportive of new groups doing things out in the community. So this Grassroots fund is separate to this, so there's nothing to stop you applying for both. I also like to highlight the Mayor's Safer Communities Fund. This is right across West Yorkshire, but this is another one that I help a lot of groups to apply to. Even though they say that projects support the police and crime plan, it's worth having a look at the criteria because it's much, much broader than you might think it is being associated to West Yorkshire Police. There's a lot about communities in there. There's a lot about feeling safer in your community and supporting vulnerable people. So even if you think that you don't support work with, say, offenders or ex-offenders and that kind of thing, don't dismiss it instantly. It's definitely worth having a look at. They do fund some really great projects. We've had quite a lot of success across Kirklees with this funding, and of course we want to see more and more local projects getting funding through that and being successful. And then awards for all. I'm sure that some of you have already applied for this. I'm just highlighting that they're small lottery grants. They're fairly recently being increased from a maximum of 10,000 to up to 20,000. And rather than just having funding for 1 year, it can now be for up to 2 years. So this has always been a great funding opportunity, again, for new and small and local groups of all types. They fund CICs as well as charities and community groups as well. It's always been one of highly recommended, and even more so now that the amount has been increased, and the criteria again is very broad. If you're doing something in your local community, I'm certain that you would meet the criteria there. So that's again one that we try and encourage people to have a go at in the early days. There's a few other resources that I recommend. We've got quite a lot of information on the TSL website about both starting up your group and applying for funding. We've also got access to a funding database via the Kirklees Council website, which is something that you'd usually have to pay for. But if you have a Kirklees postcode for your group, you can get free access to this funding database, which is linked to in these slides here. And then the funding databases that I've used for most of my career are these 5 here. I particularly highlight My Funding Central and Get Grants, also Charity Excellence Framework. Those 3 there have free subscription options for new and small groups with they have a threshold on the income level. These are the professional funding databases that's definitely worth signing up for. And signing up for notifications as well, so that it'll help you to match what you're looking for with funding that opens up. So definitely worth signing up for those.